So when I started thinking about this show, I was like, well, I always start talking about this project by talking about that it didn't start as an art project. And then, which it didn't, okay? It started that at this cottage we went to in Nova Scotia that was right on the ocean, that I just started taking pictures because I noticed that things were changing and I was struck by this. So it really just started as a habit or a compulsion, one might say, and it wasn't until later until it turned into an art project. But when I started thinking about telling that story again and the problem of repetition, I realized that at the heart of this work is repetition. For those of you who haven't seen the work, and plenty of you have, all the photos in the show, and this is an installation shot from the museum I took yesterday, all the images are of the same exact landscape, the same bay, the same skyline, the same horizon line, all shot from exactly the same vantage point and the same little raft floating within it. What stays constant is the raft floating in the middle, as well as my position in relationship to that raft on the shore. People sometimes ask me, how do you get the same vantage point over and over again? And I can tell you, the cottage that we rented had a porch this big, and once you had the barbecue there, and the water shoes there, the tripod went there, okay? Now the raft is simply a bunch of plywood put together, wood and cross beams and plywood, and it's put out there by the owner of the cottage as somewhere to swim out to and enjoy. So what was a little trickier was every year trying to get him, because he would take it out. It's just moored by ropes and cinder blocks. So trying to get him to put it in the same place. So once this turned into an art project, all of a sudden the apparatus becomes much greater, right? So I'm on the shore going, drag it this way, Les, further out, further in. And the funny thing is, it just gets blown around anyway. It can get blown completely out of the scene if there's a heavy storm. So that's part of the amusement of it. Okay, so sometimes the images are represented as single images, such as this in the project. Sometimes they're represented in grids, like this. And this is a 10 by 10 grid, and what it is a snapshot of one summer, because these are 100 distinct images of the raft. Obviously, different times of day, different colors, different things going on, but distilled to this 100 images over the course of one summer. So there's no images mixed in from other summers. And I like kind of the overall impression that that gives. It gives this kind of, I call it a snapshot of a particular summer. And they certainly vary a lot from day to day. Okay. So as you can start to imagine, even if you haven't seen the work, the point of repetition is that I have thousands of images, thousands and thousands of images. And as I said before, kind of compulsion to start taking them. Claudia would sometimes get annoyed because I was always like, we're trying to go somewhere to the farmer's market. I'm like, no, I got to get out there and take my picture. These images are taken, all the small images and the grids of small images are a digital camera, but the large single images are actually shot with a 2 1/4 camera. So they're analog images. Then the negatives are processed. Then the negatives are scanned, and then they're output through a kind of printer that takes a digital file but produces a actual C print, a photographic print that goes through chemistry. So back to this notion of repetition. We're going to get a little Freudian here, okay? Because Freud talks about a repetition compulsion. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's usually talked about in relationship to a traumatic event. So you replay the traumatic event, your behaviors are repetitious, and in a way you're trying to master that trauma and have a different relationship to it. And I actually see repetition. I've extended this concept. I know I'm kind of moving in another direction, but I think that my own practice very much takes up this repetition compulsion. Right? That I, in this instance, want to take the photos over and over again. That there's something about this process, okay? But this repetition compulsion is not new for me, okay? You can see it in a lot of my work, past and present, and most likely future. So in 2004, I started a body of work called Comfort, which this image is from. And these images, for me, were about an exploration about the two things that produce comfort for me. On the one hand, sweets and candy, particularly nostalgic candy from my childhood, like Lifesavers. And on the other hand, structure, organization, pattern. This one is actually, I donated to the museum. This is Good and Plenty, made into a, now I'm blanking on it, Barnett Newman. I think it's a Newman, I'm pretty sure. Yes, Barnett Newman. So these ones, the candy also kind of references color field painting. So that's doing another thing. But repetition is integral to pattern. If you don't have repetition, it's not a pattern, it's a texture. This is kind of design 101. I see Karen nodding. Yes, we teach design, right? And so my fascination with pattern is also part of this repetition, and also the compulsion of gluing down little tiny candies, very similar to the compulsion of amassing and sorting and sifting photographs. Oh, okay, so this is another work that, so to take it to its insane conclusion, this is actually, that's one postcard, 4x6 postcard. I made 4 iterations, that's 2 sides of each postcard, and repeated, they create this pattern, okay? But then you take this pattern, these are actually, you can see some of the seams. This is actually postcards on a wall. I filled an entire room with them. And then again in 2012, maybe, when I had a show at Brock University at Rodman Hall, I did a whole wall of them as well, right? So there's this kind of hysteria, and again, this obsessiveness that comes through in this patterning. You can also see this moving forward in my work. This is a piece that Claudia and I, this is hot off the printer, with shout outs to all the people who helped Marina with some late nights photoshopping, the other Marina who helped facilitate the picking up, over here, helped facilitate picking up the billboard because we were past deadline and Claudia and I were out of town. So you can see here again, pattern, repetition, compulsion, fastidiousness. Okay, and Claudia and I make up the collective Shake and Make, so shout out to Claudia. The other half of this, the collective of 2. Yeah, because, yeah, maybe that just says we can't get along with anyone else. Okay, moving on from repetition to observation, okay? So in Constant, what I'm really interested in is a deep observation, a contemplation of something that is familiar, trying to transform the mundane, that landscape you pass but maybe wouldn't notice. I'm often in my work, even it's evident in the billboard work as well, is to take ordinary scenes or objects and try to have an opportunity for the audience to experience them anew. So the questions I'm asking is, what happens through this sustained kind of looking? What is revealed over the accumulation of images? And these are just some of the single shots. So you're starting to see both the repetition, but the change, right? Where my vantage point and the raft stay the same, and everything else swirls around it. The process, my process, extends well after the time when I'm actually taking the pictures, as I go back in the studio and I start manipulating them, playing with them, comparing and contrasting, sorting, manipulating. What else can be revealed about this particular landscape, about this particular place through that process? So the piece is also a rumination on photography, okay? There are 2 things at the core of photography. Anyone who studied photography knows they are time and light. When we think about photography, we think about the instant when the shutter closes and you grasp that one moment in time. When we think about light, we think about the light required to strike either the film plane and the actual film to activate the silver in the case of analog, or we think about the image sensor in a digital image. And what else did I want to say? So for me, some of the works forefront different things. So in the 5x5 grids, which this is one of, I really think it forefronts this notion of time, because you get a whole bunch of snapshots that you can compare and contrast and look at and think about in relationship to each other, but then also look at them in terms of their internal design and their relationship. So one of the things I love about this image is this line that kind of extends. These clouds almost seem like they're going across. They could easily be from different years. They could be different summers, right? In these 5x5 grids, I take things that are of a similar genus, right? So this is my stormy cloud grid. So, yeah, you can go there. But But it's also clearly the project is about light, okay? And not just the light required to take an image, but the light as the driver of the change, right? This project could be called a study of light, could be understood as a study of light. So let's just look at some changing light. Next image, Claudia. That one there, that one there. And here, so this is another compare and contrast 5x5 grid that's more about kind of the color and sunsets. You've got to have at least one sunset. You got to go in for that. You got to embrace the cliche and see if you can like ride it into the ground. We'll see. Okay, convention. So besides this project being a meditation on photography, it's also a conversation with photography, which has a particular history and tradition. Anyone who's taken a basic photo class knows that, number one, you're not supposed to center the subject. Bad. You're not supposed to use a square format. Lacks dynamism, shuts things down, boring. You're not supposed to bisect the frame with the horizon. You're supposed to use the rule of thirds. So here I have broken all the rules. Another thing we teach introductory design students is that symmetry is the ultimate evil. So you can see I've broken pretty much every convention of photography. And photographs have a convention, and we're actually conditioned to respond to these conventions. So here's the convention, Ansel Adams, right? Landscape photography is supposed to be majestic, invoke the sublime, be awesome, untouched by man, unspoiled nature, all these kind of dramatic things in a landscape, vast, remote. But I'm a little bit more influenced and speaking in conversation with a group of photographers in the 70s who kind of were collected under the banner New Topographics. And these artists, Louis Baltz, Robert Adams, no relation to Ansel Adams, and this is actually a Robert Adams. Who else are some of these people? There's names that are going to escape me. Joe Deal, Stephen Shore, all dudes. There's another theme in my work. I like to make work that's, I like to inject myself in traditions that are usually dude-centric, right? It's one of the things that I'm doing. So I thought I should mention that about the New Topographics. But as you can see from this image, this is a landscape spoiled by man, right? We have palm trees, but we have what looks like something gutted and the hints of a suburban tract development. So the New Topographics artists, they also wanted to have a more commonplace and mundane landscape, but they had, it was very politically charged, right? It was really, a man-made landscape. But some of the conventions, they also broke conventions centering subjects, commonly saw a square frame with New Topographics and things like that. While I certainly identify with the New Topographics in my breaking of those other majestic and sublime traditions, I'm not politically motivated in the same way. My formal choices, besides being errors, were all made on purpose, and they're made to slow down the images, right? We're always trying to make images dynamic and sexy and to grab people's attention. And these ones are purposely quiet, slow. Something you have to kind of look into the simplicity of it, more restful kind of image. And I've made these choices on purpose. What I really am interested in is trying to cultivate a different viewing posture of my audience, right? One that's not excited in a certain way, but one that perhaps allows people to spend more time, right? That's something that I'm thinking about. Oh, okay. No, I can make those points. I'm more interested in cultivating a different type of viewing, more contemplative, more subtle, and accessible. I want to raise that point about accessibility because people who know my work know that I'm always trying to use objects and elements that actually have accessibility, right? There's an entry point. So people might know I make hockey puck paintings by shooting hockey pucks at a goal-side surface. It makes an abstract composition, but it's hockey puck shots. So all of a sudden there's a bridge into abstraction from people who've played hockey, right? So this notion of accessibility, so I feel like the landscape that I have chosen as my subject, or that has chosen me, by virtue of me having just happened upon it, is a more accessible landscape. It doesn't require that I have a big van and I go off with all my gear somewhere. It requires that I step out my door and contemplate what's in front of me. Okay, so portraiture. This has a question mark because this is kind of a postulation, right? This is like portraiture? Could it be portraiture? I'm interested in how the raft implies humans, right? So that's a new topographics, but not with destruction. This raft implies humans, as well as implies my position on the shore, my vantage point, and how this is manifest through the series. I do not believe that the project would be the same without the raft. I think the raft is actually this crucial element, this point of identification. I see it as a stand-in for the viewer, and it's a stand-in for me. And it creates this dynamic between me and the raft. And we're the things that don't change. Everything else swirling around, craziness going on. So I started wondering if these images, in a certain respect, through their accumulation, start referring to my gaze, to my positionality and my gaze, and in a certain way, my subjectivity, right? So I'm kind of wondering about this as kind of a type of self-portraiture, in a way. Could the project be a type of self-portraiture? I find these images intimate. I don't know if you do, but I do. I find them intimate in the way because they're woven into the fabric of my everyday life, right? They really imply this continual presence of mine in a particular location. And so I'm hoping that they have a kind of intimacy rather than a spectral kind of, wow factor, more intimate, more perhaps like portraiture. So in 2014, I did a photo series called Disorder. It was shown at MKG 127 in Toronto. Yeah. And in this project, I asked participants to donate their full junk drawer, which I took to the studio, and I photographed the junk drawer with all the junk in it. And then I proceeded to remove all the junk and to organize and categorize it. This is all one drawer, have you? And it started with mine. This is actually my drawer because I thought, it's a little self-portraiture in here as well. It's my drawer. I decided to analyze myself before I analyzed anyone else. So I see junk drawers as this kind of contained chaos. I sometimes, I like that Freudian thing, so kind of the id. People are just like, I don't know what to do with this, but I can't let go of it. In the junk drawer, right? So when I started making these compositions, I really was thinking about them as an insight into a person. An insight into the person who gave me the junk drawer, but also an insight into me as somebody who wants to obsessively organize, categorize, and make patterns out of it, right? So this repetition compulsion comes back. You know what I mean? This is something that's really bubbling up, and it's got some deep psychological stuff attached to it. We won't go there, okay? But interestingly, when I was making this body of work, I was also working on the documentary about my father. Some of you have seen that, and my father's a hoarder, like capital H hoarder, right? So I have these kind of poles of like wanting to hold on to things, but then also wanting to control and master and organize them and pattern them. So I definitely see these as a type of portraiture, not a conventional type of portraiture, but an access to a person and who they are, who they might be imagining, this narrative aspect. And I think it has some affinities with the Constant series. So both Constant and the Disorder photos that you just looked at could be considered an archive of everyday life. And I give a shout out to Mary O'Connor, who's a faculty member in English and Cultural Studies at the university, because she teaches a grad course on the archive and everyday life. I think, Ben, you've taken that course, haven't you? Ben took it, yeah. So part of a public conversation more recently has been, historically we've thought of an archive as, all the important papers of this important scientist, blah, blah, blah. But now we start to look at your own junk collecting, your own obsessions as archives and as potential archives, and as having vectors of meaning, right? So I do definitely think of this project as an archive. And I really think, while the individual images are nice enough, that really the power for me of this project is through this process of accumulation, right? That you really have to have a ton of this. A different thing starts happening. when taken together. The sorting, organizing, working with them, all of that is what transforms it. It's very different than seeing an image in isolation. So there's another aspect of time in this project, and that is the time that I've spent engaging with it. Okay? The time that it has been my compulsion, that I have been on the shore photographing. A decade of engaging with these images, and even longer if I continue making things out of them, even though I've actively stopped shooting. Now, I've actively stopped shooting because we were renting the same cottage, and we now bought a cottage 5 doors down, and I took that as a natural end to the project. An artist friend of mine is like, you can just shoot it from a new vantage point. And I'm like, no. Because it just felt like a natural closure. But I have started the time lapse that you saw when you came in. I have started shooting these time lapses from the new vantage point, and they may develop into something. I have some ideas related as now we become more embedded in that community. Some different ideas are coming forth. So I've started to do those, which are a little bit different, and they're also in this exhibition. The amount of images I've taken over the decade is mind-boggling. Okay, mind-boggling. Someone was asking me today, and I'm like, oh, easily 1,000 digital images a season and 10 to 12 rolls of 120 film. Anybody who shoots 2 1/4 film, there's only 12 shots on a roll. And so I was often saying to Claudia, is this worthy? Is this worthy? I only have so much film. You know, you got to mail. And also, I've probably, just anybody who wants to engage in analog photography, I've lost 30% of my negatives to sloppy and inadequate lab work. So this is kind of one of those things that's an attention in still wanting to have analog film processes. And those of us still engaged in analog film, we're partly engaged in the light quality that's produced in using analog. It is different. Depth, light, shadow, all those things are different in analog. And even if it's gone through this hybrid process where I take those analog images, scan them, and print them, you still get that overall quality. Okay, so we're now talking about the mind-boggling number of images and the compulsiveness of my own process. And so what I have is this massive amount of data and material to be sorted, analyzed, manipulated in a way. And in terms of the individual images, I try not to manipulate them a lot. You know, in Photoshop, you can bang the contrast up, you can make them super saturated. Since I'm not going for that, I'm trying to actually reflect the scene as I saw it, you know. So I'm trying to bring it in line with that to the best of my ability. But anyway, so you have this vast amount of data, but something that struck me as I've gotten so deep into this archive is that simultaneously, as I've worked on this project, there's so much more and so much less. What the hell do I mean by that? Sounds like somebody who's smoking something. What I mean is that the archive grows, so much more data accumulates, but at the same time I, and hopefully the viewer, become much more aware of the limits. The limits. I'm trying to have this comprehensive view. I'm trying to record every possible moment and manifestation, and that can't happen. That's a limit. So I like that there's this attempt to capture everything, and there's this limit, the limit of, in the face of the infinite, I have barely scratched the surface. And I think that the more I accumulate images, the more that also becomes aware. Like in the exhibition, I'm going to rest on this final image, constant horizontal. It's the only image without the raft in it. And actually, amazing, the museum is really, besides a great space, been a great supporter of mine. From the MKG show in 2012, the museum purchased this work. And interestingly, they chose the one without the raft in it. So instead, all we have are these slices of sky meets land meets water. And they're slices of time beyond the individual or its stand-in. So for me, there's an eternal quality to that, and that's perhaps what Ihor was responding to. And when I say eternal, it's not in a God way. It's more in a kind of time or cyclical way. Thank you all for coming and for listening to me.